This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good evening. Thank you. Welcome to the keynote conversation of Whose Beloved Community, Black Civil and LGBT Rights Conference. I'm Donna Yarbrough, Director of the Center for Women and Associate Vice Provost for Community and Diversity at Emory.
Good evening. I'm Leslie Harris, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies and Winship Distinguished Professor of the Humanities here at Emory, and I'm also a co-planner of the conference.
Welcome. I'm Charles Stevens, Program Coordinator for the Whose Beloved Community Conference and longtime community activist in Atlanta and nationally.
So tonight's keynote conversation also combines the resources of the Race and Gender Lecture hosted annually by Emory's Departments of African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, as well as the Center for Women at Emory Allie P. Crown Lecture on Women in Culture and Society. We're so pleased to have you here tonight and throughout the weekend to explore with us points of convergence and divergence between the Black civil rights movement and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movements through the lens of Black LGBT communities. Mainstream media tends to portray Black communities as uniquely homophobic. To be sure, homophobia is widespread in the Black community, as it is in all racial and ethnic groups. But the history of African American engagement with LGBT rights is complex. Figures such as James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, Audre Lorde, along with Coretta Scott King, John Lewis, and of course our distinguished panelists tonight, as well as many of you in the audience, have helped pave the way for the inclusion of LGBT people as full beloved members of communities across the nation and indeed across the world. And while some have come out against equality for their LGBT brothers and sisters, historian John D'Amelio has noted that the Black Congressional Caucus has historically had a more uniformly pro-LGBT voting record than the Democratic Party as a whole. And of course, our first Black president is also the first US president to come out in support of same-sex marriage.
It is also of signal importance that the Whose Beloved Community Conference is being held in Atlanta and in the South. The Southern region contains the largest concentration of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people of African descent in the United States. Reports by the National Black Justice Coalition and the Williams Institute at UCLA tell us that after New York State, Georgia has the largest population in numbers of African American LGBT individuals. And of the top 10 states in terms of African American LGBT populations, 6 plus Washington, D.C. are in the South. Yes, D.C. is in the South. In addition, the top 10 counties in the nation in terms of same-sex couples with at least one African-American householder are in the South. 3 of those counties are Atlanta metro counties: Fulton, DeKalb, and Clayton. Finally, many of these couples are raising children. The largest number of African-American LGBT families with children resides in the southern states.
Our location in the South means, of course, we face many of the challenges of being in the South. The resistance to universal health care, to fair wages, the resistance to challenging impoverishment have all taken root in the southern states, although these challenges are also faced across the country. And because of transphobia, Black, genderqueer, and transgender populations face unique challenges to equity in these areas. We are still waiting for the first southern state to approve same-sex marriage with all the financial, political, and social implications that implies. But just as pressing are the issues of how this nation will define equity for families regardless of marriage. LGBT folks have been at the forefront of alternatives to heterosexual models of marriage that oppressed women and men into rigid gender categories and responsibilities. Although approval of same-sex marriage will signify a sea change in these southern states, we must not let that stand in for a broad understanding of our responsibilities to each other, responsibilities that cannot and should not be delimited by marriage contracts alone.
So how then does the concept of beloved community help us think through these issues? We've returned to the King Center's writings on King's philosophy to share with you just a few words about King's conception of beloved community.
As many of you know, Martin Luther King Jr. popularized this idea, which originated in the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the early 20th century. For King, the beloved community is centered in a form of love distinguished by the Greek word agape. As King said, agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people. It begins by loving others for their sakes. Agape makes no distinction between a friend and enemy. It is directed toward both. Agape is love seeking to preserve and create community. Communities rooted in agape love seek justice, not for any one oppressed group, but for all people.
There are two other kinds of love, of course: eros, romantic love, and philia, love among friends. But without the strong, beloved community rooted in agape love, in nonviolence, and in justice for all, these other relationships may survive, but they will not thrive. And we want to thrive, to live whole, passionate lives. Rooted in nonviolent activism, the beloved community is the best outcome of our work and our time together this weekend. Coretta Scott King, a staunch advocate for LGBT rights, who saw LGBT rights as a continuation of the civil rights struggle, wrote about the beloved community: "Our strength to love shall bring the dream to fruition and the beloved community to earth." We encourage you this weekend not only to discuss these concepts with your heads, but to move with your hearts as well. Let's try to imagine and build here a beloved community. And by creating the example of the beloved community, we can recreate change wherever we go.
We have a number of people to acknowledge and thank before we proceed to the evening's main event. Perhaps the most important person responsible for us being here tonight is not himself here. The idea for this conference grew out of a project developed by the late Rudolph Byrd, Goodrich C. White Professor of American Studies and founding director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for Race and Difference here at Emory. We've asked his colleague and close friend, Beverly Guy-Sheftall, to offer a brief remembrance of him. Beverly is the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center and Anita Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College.
Good evening. I was asked by Leslie and Donna to say a few words about our friend and colleague Rudolph P. Byrd, who conceptualized this extraordinary project, convinced the Arcus Foundation to fund it, and proceeded to gather together a righteous, contrary, fun band of working group members from across the country: academics, administrators, poets, writers, activists, to help him carry out his vision. Despite his illness over 11 long years, Rudolph managed to put in place the framework for the project and provide a template for its successful completion, despite having left us in 2011. In fact, most of the working group were unaware of his illness and that his time was short as we gathered in Atlanta during the early phase of the project. If he were here tonight, he would be thrilled that all of us carried out our assigned tasks perfectly and that this historic conference would accomplish its ambitious goals because of the hard work of Leslie, Donna, and Charles, and the partnerships they nurtured. He would thank Roz Lee from the Arcus Foundation for her unwavering support and her role in helping to shape the project as well. Because everyone gathered here may not know Professor Byrd, I want to remember his important body of scholarship in the field of African American studies, including Black feminist studies, Black masculinity studies, and Black queer studies. His untiring work over the years with the Mellon Mays Summer Institute, his having founded the James Weldon Johnson Institute for Race and Difference at Emory University, and his stunning courage and perseverance in the face of life-threatening health challenges. To be very blunt, I don't know another human being like Rudolph. All of us who love Rudolph in this room are fortunate that our paths crossed. For me personally, the loss of his friendship has been heartbreaking. I want to end with the words of his friend and colleague, Professor Mark Sanders, here at University. Rudolph truly believed that all God's children are equal and blessed, that we can observe and celebrate difference without the creation of hierarchy. He believed that we are responsible for creating a world where wealth and resources are distributed equitably so that all people can realize their God-given potential. Indeed, he truly believed in a vision of total interrelatedness, an inescapable network of mutuality, as Dr. King put it, that makes each one of us our sisters and brothers' keeper. Rudolph's enduring contributions toward that realization of the beloved community is truly his greatest legacy.
In the wake of Rudolph's passing, a number of people stepped forward to help carry on the work that he had done, which was rooted institutionally at Emory, but had importance in Atlanta, in the nation, and indeed around the world. There was not an Emory administrator who didn't recognize the importance of Rudolph Byrd's work, including Emory's president, James Wagner, then Provost Earl Lewis, and our current Provost, Claire Stirk, and Laney Graduate School Dean, Lisa Tedesco. All have contributed generously to this conference and are in full support of the work we continue as part of the vision for the future that Emory University has for our society. But Robin Forman, Dean of the Emory College of Arts and Sciences, has truly walked beside us as we continue the work of our colleague Rudolph Byrd, and he is here tonight to welcome us all to this conference.
It's truly a great pleasure on behalf of Emory University to welcome you all to this keynote event of the conference, Whose Beloved Community. One of the reasons why we have all been so committed to this event is because it lies at the intersection of several foci of activity on our campus. Perhaps most significantly, Emory has had a long-standing commitment to understanding the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality as critical areas of intellectual work. Not only, but most explicitly and most visibly, in our powerful departments of African American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and our Studies and Sexuality program. In Emory's library system, a central mission of our Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Library, MARBLE, is the collection of materials related to civil rights and social justice movements. And this has included a concerted effort to expand our collection of historically significant lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender materials, particularly as they relate to Atlanta, its history, and its response to the AIDS crisis. And this has been part of the fabric of our campus, extending far beyond the classroom and the library. Emory was the first university in the Southeast to open an office of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender life in 1991. And it's now widely recognized as a national model for the kinds of transformative impacts such an office can have. This conference also finds its roots in the work of Emory's James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference and the vision and spirit of Rudolph Byrd, the founding director of the JWJI. As you just heard, Rudolph left us far too young, but not before forcefully leading Emory's evolution into a premier institution for the research, teaching, and public dialogue on race and intersecting dimensions of human difference. The James Weldon Johnson Institute is a place for scholars to come into conversation with each other, as well as civic leaders, artists, activists, and the larger public, founded on the idea that the work and lives of all are enhanced by a deep consciousness derived from scholarly analysis of how systems of social distinction shape identities, modes of knowing and understanding, and processes of inclusion and exclusion. The JWJI has played a central role within and outside the university, hosting critical conversations and intellectual work that supports the public policy and activism of those working for equity around issues of race, gender, sexuality, class, and other forms of human diversity. The subject of today's conference, the question of how LGBT issues have been understood and experienced in the Black communities and have intersected and diverged from the civil rights movement, leads us to engage in difficult and potentially quite uncomfortable conversations about notions of identity and community with the power to change the ways in which all of us understand and engage our world. These are important and courageous conversations at a time when the value of liberal arts institutions is being questioned. It's worth noting that universities like Emory, are the only places where these conversations are taking place, or seemingly can take place. So we are extraordinarily proud to host this important event and honored that you've joined us. Thank you for being with us tonight.
This conference would not be possible without a number of important sponsors, both within and outside Emory. In your program lists these important commitments, including the Spelman Women's Research and Resource Center, the Ford Foundation, the Atlanta Pride Committee, and Emory Center for Faculty Development and Excellence Conference Subvention Fund. But first and foremost, we must acknowledge the path-breaking support of the Arcus Foundation and Program Officer Roz Lee. Roz Lee worked with Rudolph from the inception of this grant to shape this work and continue to work with Donna, Leslie, and others at Emory to make sure the work continues. We would like to ask Roz to say a few words.
Hello, everyone. Let me just say I don't really like to say a few words. But I do want to be really clear that I work for a foundation, and I love the work that I do, but I think that foundations can make contributions, but this work should not be attributed to the foundation. It really is the work of many of the people who are in the audience, all of the people who are on the stage, and it's a privilege for the Arcus Foundation to be a partner in this work. For those of you who don't know about the Arcus Foundation, we are a global foundation that is focused on increasing respect for all of humanity and the natural world. We have two special areas of focus. One is to increase LGBT equality, and then also to increase respect and support for the great apes. Those two things seem very different, and they are different, but what they do have in common, again, is respect for all of humanity and for our natural environments. So I am only going to say a couple more words, and in my couple more words, what I really would like to say is that I am excited about the conference. When I leave this stage, I get to be a participant, I get to be in conversations, in audiences, in dialogue with people. I get to not have to wear a suit. And I get to be a part of something that is personal for me. So yes, this is my work to work with other leaders who have innovative ideas. I had the privilege of knowing and becoming friends with Rudolph Byrd. That was transformational for me to have a friend like him. But I think this is also my everyday life. It is not something that's removed from me, this intersection of racial justice and LGBT equality. As a black woman, as a black lesbian, as a black mother, sister, daughter, as a member of my community in Harlem, crossing all of these identities, as a sports fan. This is about our everyday lives. This is about the reality of the ways in which we can transform our society at these types of intersections, first in dialogue, then in practice, then in action, and then ultimately in love. Thank you.
Finally, we'd like to thank a few people critical to the success of this conference. The International Arcus Working Group, originally convened by Dr. Byrd, was key to the conceptualization of the conference. Beverly Guy-Sheftall, Jewel Gomez, Heath Fogg Davis, Robert Reid-Pharr, and Cheryl Clark are here tonight. Please stand and be acknowledged. I see you. The Arcus Working Group is also part of the conference program committee, they are listed in your program as well, which performed the important work of choosing the presentations. Those of you who are here, please stand and be acknowledged if you were part of the program committee. I can see you, you have to stand. And last but not least, I want to thank all of the Emory staff members and volunteers who are going to be working tirelessly, or who have been working tirelessly and will be working tirelessly throughout the weekend to make this happen. So thanks to them.
I'm going to wait just a minute while our main event, our central panel arrives. I'm going to take just a moment to introduce our moderator. As you know, we'd like to begin the conference with an intergenerational discussion of the meaning and activism of the Black civil rights and LGBT rights movements. Our moderator tonight is the gifted and wide-ranging public intellectual and activist Robert Reid-Pharr. Robert is Distinguished Professor of English at the City University of New York Graduate Center. His essays have appeared in journals and newspapers ranging from the African American Review to the Washington Blade. His collection of essays, Black Gay Man, won the 2002 Randy Schultz Award for Best Gay Nonfiction, and his book, Once You Go Black, Choice, Desire, and the Black American Intellectual, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. Robert has also worked with the now-defunct Gay Rights National Lobby and with the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays. In that capacity, he became associated with such Black gay literary and political figures as Essex Hemphill, Gil Gerald, and Barbara Smith. So I'm now going to turn it over to our guests and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It is a great honor to be here this evening. The first thing I have to say is that I just want you all to take an opportunity to take a look at yourselves. I can see you, and when people talk about the state of the civil rights movement and the state of the LGBT movement and they bemoan it, they're not looking at the people that I'm looking at now. You're delicious to my eyes. I have now the truly high but somewhat strange honor to introduce people whom everyone knows already unbelievably well, but I'll do my best. Immediately to my left is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and she told me that she's named, her middle name Pauline is for her mother, and I think Mama Pauline is here. You did okay, Miss Pauline. You did all right. Alexis Pauline Gumbs is a queer black troublemaker, a black feminist love evangelist, and we're going to talk about what that means. A prayer poet, priestess with a PhD in English, African and African American Studies, and Women and Gender Studies from Duke University. She is the founder of Brilliance Remastered, which helps visionary, underrepresented graduate students stay connected to purpose, passion, and community. She's a co-founder of the Mobile Homecoming Project, a national experiential archive amplifying generations of Black LGBTQ brilliance, and she is creator of the blog Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind. I'm just going to repeat it so you can find it online. It's Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind. I'm going to repeat it again because I just like it. Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind. She was named one of Utne Reader's 50 Visionaries Transforming the World in 2009 and was awarded a Too Sexy for 501c3 trophy in 2011. She was one of the Advocate's top 40 under 40 in 2012 and one of Go Magazine's 100 Women We Love in 2013. Thank you so much for being here. To her left is the visionary and the hero to us all. We'll just say it and get it out. I'm glad I said that because I have been nervous for weeks about actually doing this introduction. So I can breathe a touch. Julian Bond is a leader of the American Civil Rights Movement. While a student at Morehouse College here in Atlanta, he helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Thank you for that. Elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 1965, he served until 1975, when he began the first of 6 terms in the Georgia Senate. Thank you for that. In 1968, Julian Bond led a challenge delegation from Georgia to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and was the first African American nominated for Vice President of the United States. He withdrew. Thank you for that. He withdrew his name from the ballot because he was too young to serve. That moment when you do that is filmed, and I play it over and over for party guests, I have to say. So thank you for that. He was president of the Atlanta branch of the NAACP for 11 years. And in 1998, he was elected chair of the NAACP National Board and served for 11 terms before stepping down in 2010. He is President Emeritus of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he hosted America's Black Forum from 1980 until 1997. Today, Julian Bond is a distinguished visiting professor at American University in Washington, D.C., and a professor of history at the University of Virginia. He has received 25 honorary degrees. It is a particularly special treat for me to be able to introduce those of you who do not know her to Mandy Carter. Alrighty, well, it seems none of you don't know her. Mandy, I just want to, before I read your bio, I just want to say to you, also thank you from the heart. I met Mandy in 1983 as a freshman at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I have to say, I wasn't supposed to rev the crowd up, but I have to say that when I met you, that really was a life-changing moment for me. I had not ever met, I don't think, person who had identified themselves to me as a black lesbian person ever. And forget all that. You were one of the smartest persons I'd ever met, one of the kindest, one of the most eloquent, and you had an impeccable fashion sense that I've tried to follow it. I've tried to follow it. I have tried. It's been tough. Mandy Carter is an African-American lesbian social justice activist with a 45-year history of racial, and LGBT justice organizing. She was national coordinator of the 2013 Byrd Rustin commemoration project of the National Black Justice Coalition, a national effort to acknowledge, honor, and celebrate black gay civil rights activist Byrd Rustin. Carter co-founded two groundbreaking organizations, Southerners on New Ground, SONG. Thank you for that. And the National Black Justice Coalition. She was one of the 5 national co-chairs of Obama LGBT Pride, the LGBT grassroots infrastructure for Barack Obama's historic 2008 presidential campaign. Thank you, Mandy. She has done the hard and long-lasting work of organizing grassroots networks, especially with people of color throughout the South. She lives, as does Alexis, in Durham, North Carolina, which is apparently a Southern paradise. Can you guys hear me from here?
Can you adjust the mic? Can you hear us? All right. And can Robert be a little louder?
Hello.
Yeah, I think they're, where's the?
Hi. Oh,
yeah.
Okay, sorry. I have no control over the technology at all, so. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here. The first thing I'm going to do is be a little bit self-indulgent and ask you the question that I really want to ask you before we get to anything else. And that is, one of the great things about this panel is that it's intergenerational. There is a person who's a little bit younger than me and a couple of people who are tiny, a smidge older than me. And my question really to you personally is what really is motivating you to stay doing the type of work that you're doing? Why is it that you're organizing both in the civil rights movement and in the LGBT movement, both when we know that it's such a difficult and hard road to follow?
We'll start with Alexis.
Oh, all right. This is what keeps me doing work like this. To be able to see, I mean, these two people right here and several people who I can see in the room who exemplify what it is to wake up every day, loving the people, unapologetically, strategically, exuberantly, consistently. That's what it is. So I think the importance of the fact that this is an intergenerational conversation is that people need to be able to see what it looks like on an everyday basis, not just in the specific moments of victory or the highly publicized moments, but what that everyday practice of love looks like. So what the two of you specifically, and also just what it represents for you to be continuing to do this work is a direct resource into when I wake up in the morning, what does it mean to say, how do I love the people today? Maybe sometimes after lunch I have to say it again. How do I love the people? Maybe after a nap. But I think that is it for me up in this community in Atlanta, doing youth organizing with some people who are in the room also, and being able to see what's possible when we push those things out of the way that would disconnect us.
Alexis, can I ask you a question to follow up on that? So,
Yeah.
I mean, you're one of the things that you have done and that you're doing as youth organizing. How do you maintain that to doing middle-aged people organizing and doing organizing over the entirety of your lifespan? How do you actually keep that fire in the belly and also sustain yourself in that process?
Yeah, I mean, you have to ask other people how you sustain for a long time, because I'm trying to just get some osmosis for decades of awesomeness from the people who are here near me. But I think all being in the same room together is really important. So the Mobile Homecoming Project is an experiential archive project that really believes if we can be in the same space, if there are infants in the room and there are great-grandparents in the room and chosen great-grandparents in the room, we really do tell our best stories in our clearest ways. We really do remember the ceremonies that we need and the circles that we need to be able to sustain each other. And I think that that's worth creating. What does it take for us all to literally be in the room? I think that there's something about us all being at the table when we talk about access to power, and I think there's something about the intimacy of physically being in the same room and being able to see each other grow. I think that's the sustainable, renewable resource that I feel like I have access to through being in rooms like this, and also through the ongoing work of co-creating the Mobile Homecoming Project.
Thank you. Mandy, I know that you have been doing that work that you're doing for a while. Do you have advice to Alexis about how to continue it?
Well, actually, what I was going to say is that I'm going to throw out this demographic that I think is real pertinent around this particular conversation, and I always mention this. Right now, and this will be relevant about why I'm sitting in this chair and why this person next to me has been my inspiration, but right now, women are the numerical majority. By 2050, this country will be majority people of color, and this is the demographic that I love the most. Post-World War II baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964, anyone in the room who was then under that age, who's in that age group, could you please raise your hand? 1946 to 1964. 79 million of us, 60s generation. Anyone sitting in this room that's between the ages of 18 and 25. 80 million of you. If ever there was a moment to have this, not only the intergenerational conversation, but the intersectional. And what I find so striking is that as someone who's identified as a young black lesbian, upstate New York, Schenectady, graduated high school in 1966, and to think about where we were then and all these big, huge 50th anniversary, 60th anniversary of these huge civil rights moments, for us to be in the same space to be able to celebrate that, honor that, and to really kind of strategize about it could not be more of a moment for me. I want to just share a quick story like why I'm sitting here, but it's not unique to me. Remember, 64, 65, 66, these are the years when the huge stuff was coming out of the South, the images and the pictures out of the South from down South. And our social studies teacher, never heard of this organization, brought this young white guy in from the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. And the three things he said that day is why I'm sitting here right now. The first thing he said is that the Quakers have had this long, long history of always being about equality and justice. After slaves were released, they were the ones who were down at the Penn Center were teaching how slaves were going to read and write. So they've had this legacy as a predominantly white group. But the American Friends Service Committee is in a white ally group down south talking about what they could do to make change. The second thing that I didn't get at the time, but I have it now, the power of one, that each and every single person has the potential to impact change if they so choose to act on it. But it was the third thing that was the clincher. By the way, we have an AFSC high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains who would like to go. That's what made the difference. Because I think sometimes, I mean, I'm watching this series now, Eyes on the Prize, probably the best documentary series. It's one thing if someone gets you excited and jazzed up and you feel like someone really touched me, but to go and spend a week to read about Gandhi, to read about nonviolence and the philosophy and direct action, but they were bringing people up from down south to come and talk about what they were doing down there. And I remember this, there was this young white folk singing couple called Guy and Candy Carowin from the Highlander Center. The Highlander Center where Rosa Parks and Dr. King went for their training for the bus boycott. So to have that genuineness of it, and they're still at the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. I only share that, Robert, because I think for me, to hear that and then being presented the opportunity to be a part of the movement, Stop the Draft Week, Vietnam, feminism, and then also identifying myself as a young black lesbian. I don't think we had the L word back in the day, it might have been H. Anyway, to make a long story short. But now you get paid to do this as a vocation. If it hadn't been for family foundations and other foundations that pay you to do this work, or donors, I have to give a shout out to a couple of people if I could, please. Southerners on New Ground was just an idea back in 1993. It was, and I'm making sure I don't lose any names, Pat Hussein, if she's in the house right here. Pat, Miss Pat. Joan Garner from Atlanta. In the house. Suzanne Farr. Mab Segrist from Durham. Pam McMichael from Louisville, Kentucky. Mandy Carter, I think I hit everyone, but our current co-directors, Caitlin Breedlove and Paulina Helm Hernandez, are they in the house? Thank you. And finally, Sharon Letman Hicks is our current executive director for the National Black Justice Coalition. Sharon, where are you? I hope you're here somewhere. Yes, thank you. So what sustains me is not only the ability to see the change that you can have happen, but Alexis is right. If we don't figure out a way to have an intergenerational conversation and a movement about how that can make the difference and how that can make change. But look at the demographics, look at this room and how many multiple identities we walk in every day and why each one of those has to have that full equality and justice for all. And I think it's in my blood. I just got my Medicare card. I turned 65 last month. Right. I started out at 19, but if he can do it, I can do it. That's why I'm here.
Before we move on to ask Julian the question, I asked everybody if I could use their first name, so now we're BFFs. So I'm just going to refer to everyone by their first name, as uncomfortable as I am doing it, but I'll do it anyway. I wanted to just follow up with one question between you and Alexis. It really strikes me that you guys have just talked eloquently about what motivates you ethically and spiritually, let's say, in terms of the work that you do and how it is that you can be in it over the long run. It really strikes me, though, that both of you are doing your work, all of you are doing your work while being located primarily in southern states. So would the two of you like to make some argument about the sort of necessity of being in Durham, North Carolina, where you are, or in a place like Atlanta for doing this type of work at the intersection of the civil rights movement and LGBT organizing?
Well, you know, it's interesting when because after I had done the high school work camp, I wanted to be a doctor, and I said, that changed everything. I ended up moving to San Francisco to work for the War Resisters League, which is like, 1923. But I missed the Four Seasons, so I said, I'll take any job east of the Mississippi. Well, the only place there was a job was Durham, North Carolina, with the War Resisters League Southeast. I said, I'm moving to Durham, and my friend said, you're moving where? I'm still living there. There's something about the South, there's this great quote, so goes the South, so goes this country. And there's something about being committed, dedicated to make the change in where you live. I can understand why people leave it. When I was in San Francisco, I could not believe the number of Southerners who were living in that town because they all left here to go there, or Chicago or New York, but now there seems to be a migration back. But for me, the idea that and the South, you think about not only the South in terms of the civil rights movement itself, but other movements for change that have happened, and even currently now. I can't imagine not working here. And so the idea that the work is of, by, and about Southerners, but also there's a huge mass migration of people moving to the South, not from the South. And how do we get them engaged in terms of Southern issues and Southern involvement in which they can do as well. So when we chose the name Southerners on New Ground, I'm not even sure how we came, it was an interesting long story. But Southerners on New Ground, but also we partnered with, as an LGBT and progressive organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center. We were working with the farm workers and talking immigration issues. So the South has always seemed to have this very kind of, very dynamic, beyond just us kind of mentality, and how we bring all of who we are and all the issues connected, intentionally intersectional, and this is an amazing place to have it happen right here in the South. I ain't moving, I'm here to stay.
Okay. Did you want to?
Yes. I mean, the story I always love to share is that when The only place there was a job was in Durham, was 1982 when Mandy Carter moved to Durham. I was born in 1982. I appreciate Mandy for getting Durham ready for me to live there, and I feel the same way. I'm not leaving. I think that it's true that we can see the resilience of oppressed people in the South in a way that you could see it all over the world, but there's something about the way that people have been creative, come together, address those issues, not because they were going to get credit for it, not because they were following resources, but because that was where they were grounded and what they had to do to honor the legacies of where they stood. So I feel really proud to live and do this work in the South, and specifically in Durham, which I feel like is a vortex in the center of the universe, and any of you who don't live there now, I'll be recruiting you to come live in Durham, but that's a longer term vision for the Republic of Durham. But yes, this is so crucial, and I really think that, you know, I've heard a lot of the conversation that comes through Southerners on New Ground about what it means specifically to claim this space in the South as a place that people can return to, who have left for reasons of their safety, for reasons of being able to seek, being able to be who they were, and needing to be who they are, and what it means to create this as a space that people can come home to and be who they fully are. I think that's sacred work. I think that's work that generations of our ancestors are also helping fuel us to do, and I'm proud to be a part of it.
Okay, Mr. Julian Bond, it's time for you to lay down some wisdom.
It's easy for me to answer the initial question that you asked by saying what they said. And also should mention that Guy Carawan, who was mentioned a moment ago, was the first person I heard singing We Shall Overcome. He taught the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to sing We Shall Overcome when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was not 2 days old. He came to Raleigh, North Carolina, where we had our first convention, our first organization meeting, and he sang this song, which I'd never heard before. Within months, we were all singing it. So the movement owes him an enormous, enormous debt. But I do what I do because people ask me to do it. The first time somebody asked me to do it, I was in Yates and Milton's drugstore here in Atlanta, across the street from Morehouse and Clark College. And I'm sitting drinking a cup of coffee, either instead of class or between classes. And a Morehouse student whom I knew only because he was a football player came up to me and held up a newspaper and said, "Have you seen this?" And I was insulted because I thought the question was, do you read a newspaper? And I knew every college student read a newspaper every day. And I was upset because I thought he was suggesting I didn't. He said, no, I mean this story. And I looked at the story, it said Greensboro students sit in for third day. And it told how black students from Northern Carolina A&T, Carolina A&T, for the third day in a row had gone to the local Woolworths department store and sat down at the lunch counter and asked to be served. They weren't served. They got up, another group took their place. They stayed an hour, got up, another group took their place. And at the end of the day, they said, we'll be back again. And he said, what do you think about that? I said, oh, that's wonderful, that's great. He said, don't you think it ought to happen here in Atlanta? I said, oh yeah, somebody's gonna do it here in Atlanta. And he said, why don't we do it here? And before I could answer anything, he said, you take this side of the cafe, I'll take this side, and we'll do it. This guy's name was Lonnie King. And no relationship to Martin Luther King, but really the originator of the Atlanta student movement. After a couple of weeks, we had created a group and we had started what became the Atlanta student movement. There's a lot more to it than that. But I got into this work because he asked me to do it. And I got into other things because other people asked me to do it. And I was thinking about specifically this work that we're about here tonight, is that I went to school with gay people, high school and college, and I worked in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with gay people. And having seen them help me, how could I not help them? How could I not say, what help do you need and can I do it? Can I join into it? And so it was easy for me to do this kind of stuff because somebody asked me.
that's an unbelievably beautiful thing to say. But it wasn't easy. It's not easy. And you know, one of the things that I think should be acknowledged is that I think part of the reason that you have a bit of rock star status in this community is in fact that you've stood up for LGBT rights as a true pillar of the civil rights movement. And that can't have always been such an easy road for you to hoe. I wonder whether or not there have been particular challenges that you faced to stand on your principles around these issues.
It's a story that I'm not ashamed to tell it because there's no shame connected to it. But I was chairman of the NAACP, as you said in your introduction, for 11 years. Officers in the NAACP have one-year terms, so I was reelected for 11 years. And each of those 11 years, I said to myself, and only to myself, I wish I could get this group to endorse gay rights, same-sex marriage particularly. But then I said to myself, no, I won't do that because they'll say no. And I'd rather we had no position than a bad position. So I'm not going to bring this question up. And during the 11 years of my tenure, I never mentioned it, never mentioned it. I mentioned it when I made speeches, when I talked to them, but I never tried to get the board, NAACP board, to endorse it. Now, the NAACP board is 64 people. And one day after I had stepped down from the chairmanship, I'm sitting around the table, and this guy over here says, I move that we endorse same-sex marriage. And I said to myself, oh, no, don't do that, that's awful. Because they'll say no, and then we'll have this bad position. Be just awful, don't do that. But somebody said, I second the motion. And somebody said, I would have voted against this last year, but I'm for it now. And other people said, I feel the same way, and I kept thinking, you know, that's gonna be a majority. So maybe out of the 64 people, maybe 32 will vote for it. Well, we have 64 people on the board. That day, 2 people were absent, including the biggest homophobe on the NAACP board. He was not there. And they voted 60-2 to endorse same-sex marriage. And I felt so good and so bad at the same time. Good that they had done this wonderful thing, and so bad that I had underestimated these people and hadn't understood that they moved as the rest of the country moved and went from here to here to here.
Also, a quite amazing story. I just want to follow up and ask you 2 questions from that. First, is what you're saying that perhaps we misjudge what we would think of this as the traditional civil rights infrastructure of this country, the traditional civil rights leadership on the issue of LGBT equality, LGBT rights, that perhaps that community is more receptive to those arguments than at least I might imagine?
Yes, I think that's true. I think the country is more receptive to these arguments than we give the country credit for. Yeah.
And then here's the big question for me. So what happened to that guy who said that, you know, last year I wasn't going to vote for it, but this year I am going to vote for it?
I think many different things probably happened to him. I think on the one hand, he said, you know, John in my church who sings in the choir is gay, I think. And he seems to be a wonderful guy. Why should I deny him rights that I enjoy? Why should I treat John in this way? Or he said, you know, I see that X group of people say this is okay, and, you know, they could have a point. That could be something that really, and I think they saw gay people on TV, and I mean in these silly sitcoms. They saw the gay people on TV and said, gee, they're okay, they seem to be okay. They're not weird like I thought they would be. So I think 100 different things got to this guy and changed his mind.
Well, I had shared this with Julian when we were having dinner. And by the way, thank you, Emory. I can't thank you enough. Beverly from Spelman, Spelman in the house and, you know, whatever. Because I'm also looking at those who precede us when I look at my role models too. But I was sharing that when you had mentioned the National Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum, which had been around for quite some time, and there was a decision for them, which is fine, to shut the doors. Well, a lot of us thought in terms of time frame, we cannot have nothing So we had gathered our nickels and dimes and quarters and rented the National Press Club December of 2003 and thought it was good to do two things. One was to say that there would continue to be a face and voice of our Black LGBT community, to be the face of those who cannot be seen, to be the voice for those who cannot be heard. And also to go on record, because remember, Massachusetts has just gone down in this huge, amazing thing around the whole same-sex marriage issue up in Massachusetts. So we're having a press conference to say, those of us formerly of the Leadership Forum, but also to say publicly, as the African-American community, we support marriage equality. Well, only 3 people showed up for that press conference. One was from the Washington Post, got a good story out of it, and I don't remember who the other 2 people were. The very next day, we got a phone call from Julian Bond to H. Alexander Robinson with these words, "What can I do to help?" That very next year in Baltimore at the National NAACP convention, for the first time ever, they had a Black LGBT table at that convention. 6 years later, in 2009, when at the 100th anniversary convention in New York City, for the first time ever, the NAACP created the first ever LGBT task force with the National Black Justice Coalition, historic. Julian Bond, Alice Huffman, California, to have that statement and to have that national figure and to see these 2 traditional, we don't normally get along with each other, to have those moments happen, I cannot tell you. It's now 2014. And think about where we were, where we are now. All I can say is, and also not only you, Julian, but thinking of the National NAACP, but Reverend William Barber, North Carolina NAACP. So this conversation about why we should compare or how we do it, a lot of it's just in practice already happening, but who's going to take the other bold steps as well? So a personal thank you.
I want to just take that in a little bit of a different direction and just ask you directly, because you mentioned several Black LGBT organizations that existed up until basically the early 90s in this country. Probably the most prominent of them being the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays. Do you think that at this moment in 2014 that it's necessary for us to have specifically Black LGBT civil rights organizations?
Oh my God, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, yes. Because we just got done showing the film New Black, and I want to acknowledge Dennis Wiley, who's in the audience here, because when we had that battle around marriage equality in the District of Columbia in Maryland, and you think about the fact that when I hear, this is what I'll hear, and it happened at an HBCU conference, by the way, there was a person from an HBCU and said, "I don't think I have any gay students on my campus." So if you don't have anyone who's identified as a national and or local or regional and saying this is who we are, this is our agenda, this is what we're going to do, they said you don't exist, so we have to have them. This is the part, and I'm going to address this right to Arcus. Hi, Roz. Here's my issue. The National Black Justice Coalition not doing with anything with AIDS, it's like that there's only a handful of national of color any LGBT. That's criminal. I'm going to put those words out there. It's unbelievable that we don't have the kind of funding, the kind of resources we have, because with that demographic shift, but the idea that we have to support our communities and our allies, not to have the resources to provide us to have more, not less, that, in my opinion, is what needs to change and what needs to happen. Part of the weekend, I hope, is part of that conversation. So no, we need more, not less, I would say. And all the communities of color, not just African American, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, Two-Spirit, Indigenous, so on and so forth. More, not less.
I'm gonna change gears just a touch. I just thought, especially since you mentioned that very interesting film, The New Black, and also because we were in this particularly lovely edifice, that I just wanted to talk about the ways in which the Black religious community interfaces or doesn't interface with LGBT issues. I'll just share with you that I was raised to be a devout Pentecostal, and in many ways love the church. And I will say, if this is a writer thing between us, that part of the reason I'm a writer today is because Pentecostalism teaches you that words are powerful things that make change in the world. And I thought, oh, they've got that right. That's actually the truth. But certainly by the time I was an adult and a man, and a gay man, I didn't want to have anything to do with Pentecostalism or with any black religiosity at all. So how do we hold in the same hand all of those wonderful things that we get in our religious life, people who both devout and believe, and people who just enjoy the community, and deal with the questions of some of the very, very negative rhetoric and practice that comes out of churches led by black people in this country? It's an easy question.
Yeah, Lucas, go down the line. Go ahead.
It's not an easy question for me. I don't go to church. I've never belonged to a church. I don't practice any religion, so it's not an easy question for me.
So there.
I have to say, no. First place, the easy question comment was a joke.
Oh, okay.
That all said, I'm certain that in your life as an activist, you've had to interact with ministers, with church communities. That part of the reason that we're able to do this event is because we're in a church. How do you use those resources and also fight some of that belief? That's what I want to know.
When they are on your side, you use them, and use them sounds like a bad use of words, but where the church is on your side, then you embrace it and get it to help you move forward. When it's against you, then you try to convince them of the wrongness of their views, and that's it. But and I have been to church. I don't want you to think I've never been in the building, but I don't go to church, and I don't belong to a church. I had this same relationship with the Quaker church as a young man and was just blown away with what I learned in Quaker meeting. Unfortunately, I haven't followed going to these meetings from that day to this, but I was just blown away by, this, what they say, speaking truth to power. I heard that at Quaker meeting, speaking truth to power. I thought, wow, that's a powerful thing, but it's nothing I do.
Go ahead.
Please go, Alexis.
Well,
Please.
I think what I wanted to, as a fellow unchurched person here in the South, that's more than a notion. I think that's, I appreciate that you said that. And I think that, however, I would never underestimate the spiritual resources and like what spiritual resources have meant for the movements that we're talking about here, and to understand that a lot of that energy of the singing and the standing up and the falling out has been, I claim it all actually as queer energy, whatever the identities of the people performing it were and are. I think that's queer energy, and I also believe that we have to think about that, not to underestimate the institutional power of the church, of course, definitely sitting in a church as I'm saying this, but I think that for me, I'm not looking for a church as an individual. I'm really looking for a dance team, because when I think about the spiritual energy that reaches back, I specifically think about experiences here at Atlanta Black Gay Pride and at Detroit Black Gay Pride of J-set teams in their face-off competitions. And if y'all haven't seen these dance formations, then you can just YouTube right now while I'm talking, because we really should not wait another moment. When you want to talk about, it's just like spiritual leadership, you can see it going back thousands of years. Like, you can see the power in people fully expressed, and I truly would live in a country where the next administration was decided through a dance-off through this type of organization. And I think it's important to acknowledge those resources. It's important to acknowledge the ball culture. It's important to acknowledge the spiritual embodied institutions that Black folks have created and that they funded in so many ways, that they funded through sex work, that they funded barely, that they have, I don't know if they shoplifted the outfits, I don't even know, how people have gotten it together to do it, but they have, and that also has, I think, a direct tie to everyone else who's been making the way out of no way to start a library in their church and all of this. So I think that the power of something like the Unity Fellowship movement and the power of seeing Black, LGBT, and Q-identified folks reclaim religious practice and create those spiritual spaces is one really powerful thing that I want to emphasize and say that we should support. But also to say that, I mean, I'm a Black feminist love evangelist, right? Like in Durham, people who have public access TV shows are like people talking about Jesus and the Hebrew Israelites and me talking about praise Audre Lorde. And so I think that our alternative evangelism, you know, and our like for the people, unbound Pentecostalisms, you know, like I am the type of person that shouts just about how much I love Black women especially, and Black people and Black queer folks, and people of color. It may happen, it may happen. It may happen. But so I think that that's important to acknowledge. I don't underestimate the strategic question of what the influence of Black churches are in Black communities and what the resources are. And I think it's also connected to this conversation that I know we were wanting to have about how evangelism has been used in particular countries in Africa in fueling these terrible violent laws against LGBTQ people on the continent. And I think that we really have to bolster our alternative evangelisms, like the spiritual power and energy that we know that we have access to, and we don't only have access to with the sanction of particular homophobic churches. We have it, we just been always had it, and we have it everywhere, and we have it in all of these ways. So I think that's important to remember, to support, to participate in, but also to get everything, to fund, to show up for, and to dance with me. I'm looking for a dance team.
Mandy, did you want to get into this?
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that came up in the New Black was this idea that a lot of people just got tired of going every Wednesday and Sunday being harangued around this homophobia. And so what I like, though, is that the idea that you create options. The Unity Fellowship Church movement has been deep. I just saw Kofi, I don't know if she's in here, but Unity Fellowship Church movement, you have Bishop Yvette Flunder, there you are, there you think, Kofi. Bishop Yvette Flunder with City of Refuge. I mean, I think sometimes rather than saying, I'm leaving and there's nothing I'm going to do, you say, I'm going to stay and I will embrace, but I want to do it in a way that embraces of all who I am. So don't leave it if you don't have an option of what you can do to create it. But one other lesson I learned in the film, there's this issue around Cincinnati in 1992. And one of the things, and this is happening with the National Organization for Marriage, remember how they said the best thing they could do is to create a wedge between the gay community and the Black community? Well, gay people are Black and Black people are gay. And this idea of trying to create this wedge, it's almost as if the only people who are gay are white. They're rich, they're privileged, they're trying to hijack the civil rights movement. And then you have them understanding that the white folk can't come up and say that they'll get a Black minister to be the face and voice of that. And unfortunately, all you need is one or two. And in Cincinnati, I was there on the ground with Reverend Casey Smith. And I'll just put this on the table. I want to see some IRS forms because I want to know how much folks are being paid or I want to know what else is going on, because one of the things I highlighted with the Casey Smith, with all due respect, is that he was getting a tremendous amount of press coverage, his wife, but all the money that was coming in behind the scenes was not coming from the Black community, it was coming from Colorado for Family Values. It came across state lines and dumped it into Cincinnati. Don't tell me that when we watch what's happening with the National Organization of Marriage, and you see how all that money is coming in, but they were smart. But they do what we don't do. Prop 8, where were the faces of color of the Black folk that said, we do support marriage equality, we do believe in equality and justice? Where were we? And then when it didn't go right with Prop 8, the first people they blamed was the Black community. But where were they? Were they at the table when they were planning and strategizing? They didn't go into the churches. So strangely enough, it's our opposition that does the very thing that we're not doing. So what lesson have we learned from that?
There are a million questions that I'd like to ask specifically about religious practice and religious communities and the LGBT movement, particularly the way that all affects people of African descent. Instead, I just wanted to go directly and ask you again to sort of expound on the thing that you ended on, Mandy, and maybe have the two of you also get involved in that. So you were saying that, listen, after the Proposition 8 thing, it seems that, you know, many of the faces saying that we're against same-sex marriage, we're Black faces, and then the Black community is blamed for it. How do activists, how do the people in this room get control of the ways in which Black opinion about issues around sexuality, about the LGBT community, lesbian, gay, and transsexual community. How do we actually take control of the way that we're represented in media and actually put out some more positive images of what we're actually doing?
Well, you make noise. You make as much noise as you can. You make as much noise in the church, the physical building, or where they gather, where they meet. You argue, you scream, you yell, you shout, you work hard. The way you do fight anything, you make noise about it.
I think you're right. And I have to say, one of the things that I was struck by, in fact, we're going to do a workshop on Saturday at 8:30 with Dennis, myself, and Sharon, to really address this, because one thing I found even though Cincinnati happened, and another quick story, Ypsilanti, Michigan, this is just so interesting to me. They already had an existing civil rights ordinance on the books. Someone went to make some flyers somewhere. The company said, we ain't going to print no flyers with no gay nothing on it. That created a whole uproar. Anyway, to make a long story short, there was going to be a big rally held before the big vote. And the opposition, this is what they brought in. The Whiting sisters, who just done that song around Ellen coming out, the football player from Minnesota, Reggie White, and Alveda Celeste King. Because of the pro-gay group, because it was all white, they felt they didn't have any possibility of saying anything around this. I get a phone call from Dawn Richburg, who's a black lesbian at the American Friends Service Committee. She says, what do you think we should do? I said, what we should probably do in silence is stand here with our black and allies with a sign that says, you know, equality and justice for all, and just stand there. But it was Coretta Scott King from Atlanta who dropped a letter into every single voter in Ypsilanti, Michigan, about the reason why this issue is so important. And don't call it gay marriage, call it marriage equality and all the issues. Despite all the money, despite the facts that they had, the folks they had in that concert or whatever, the next day the vote went our way. To me, that lesson was learned because the white community was saying, we're not going to show up because we think we're going to be racist. Well, they didn't have any folk of color in their organization to begin with that could have been the face and voice for the opposition or to talk about that. You see what I'm saying? So this was an opportunity, but that was an important lesson. But I had ministers say to me, but Mandy, you don't hear me say anything anti-gay. I said, thank you, but we don't hear you saying anything. Your silence is the voice of complicity. Oh. Well, then you saw Maryland and D.C. That was amazing what got pulled together up there in terms of black ministers, not gay, allies, standing saying, this is time for us to stand up and say enough. But we also going to say we embrace. And they got it in D.C., they got it in Maryland. So I think this idea about faith people of faith having a pivotal role to play in this is key. But also maybe they're the ones who have the other conversations with the other congregations. And also what about our divinity schools and who's getting all this training and whatnot? There might be opportunities to kind of shift the conversation or change the dynamic of what's happening. And I only still go to Quaker meetings, by the way.
Thank you. There are a few more questions that I want to ask before we open it up to the audience here. And one, it really is about this issue of silence, because it's not just a contemporary issue, but it's also an historical issue. So I know, Mandy, that you have done an enormous amount of work around bringing back the true history of Bayard Rustin's accomplishments and his gifts to all of us. And I was really taken, Mr. Julian Bond, I think I'm just going to call you that, Mr. Julian Bond, when you said that it's easy for you to, it was easy for you to understand lesbian and gay rights, lesbian and gay sensibilities because you knew lesbian and gay persons. I'm assuming also in the movement. So I wonder how it is that we can actually bring back this history of persons, LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender persons who existed in the civil rights movement and bring that to the fore and make that happen. I wonder how you've done it with Bayard Rustin, and I wonder how you guys would imagine doing that in the future.
Well, I want to ask, this is a question since we were told we could ask each other a question. I have one for you, Julian. On that hot, muggy day, Wednesday, August 28, 1963, I want to ask you something. Did you think in your lifetime that literally 50 years later to the day that it would be Barack Obama on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, that we would have former President Carter and former President Clinton, both from Arkansas and Georgia. Did you think it was possible that this would happen within the span of 50 years?
I didn't think Barack Obama would be president until he won the Iowa caucus, and I thought, if he can carry this white state, then he can do it. And so I became a supporter. I thought it was foolish for me to waste my vote on this man. He's not going to win. There's no way he can win. This won't happen. The country will not do it, won't go for it. But when he won in Iowa, it got over with me. And maybe because I lived in Georgia and I knew Jimmy Carter and knew him, that I was not surprised to see him on the mall, on the Washington Mall. And because I had met Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas, and had a warm feeling toward him, and most of the time a warm feeling toward Governor Carter. And so it was not surprising for me to see these two men, because I knew these two men, and I knew what they felt, I knew what they believed, and I thought they were decent people, and so it's not surprising to see them there at all. It's more surprising to see Barack Obama there.
And also being, okay.
Yeah.
I only asked that to put it in reference point, and I was going to ask you the same thing, Alexis, too, because one of the things that and I have never met Barack, I had never met Byrd Rustin, and it wasn't until I was at that high school work camp that we had heard about the Quakers, his background, and then, but what I was struck by, though, is that it's been a 30-year journey, because when that march happened on August 28, 1963, it wouldn't be until 1983 they would start doing their annual every 10-year celebrations, thanks to Coretta Scott King and others. And I remember that in 1983, it was the DC Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gay Men who said, we have got to have a black lesbian. We want Audre Lorde to speak on that stage at Lincoln Memorial. And they said, hell no. Our people are not ready to hear all that. And it turned out they had to sit in the offices of Walter Fauntroy.
Yes, you need to sit in his offices now.
And we can go back and sit in his offices now. Yeah. But that was 83, and it wasn't until 2013 when we were able to finally get the final recognition, and I think the highlight was when he got the Medal of Freedom. But you know who was sitting right next to him at the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in addition to Walter Nagel, his surviving partner, was the surviving partner of Sally Ride, who didn't come out as a lesbian until after she was gone. So I just think about, you know, because this idea about not being out and not being able to be visible, it's not just unique to our community. But I think the unique situations when we can have the ability to have the allies, to have the people that are willing to say, I'm willing to stand here as a big A, as an ally, and make that connection. And so now the big question having why the timing of this conference could not be more important, now what? He's a dead guy, he got the Medal of Freedom, that's great, but now where do we go from here with this broader conversation? And what I love is that it's intergenerational, because look, Alexis, you and me, and here you are. And where do we go from here in terms of the future of what's possible? But thank you, Byrd Rustin. I can't thank him enough for the work that he did, and a lot of it was in total silence.
Please, go ahead.
I think that question about, and you had raised it earlier when we were talking about what about those people who were participants in these movements, and what about and I think there are people in this room who are going to be presenting this weekend about uncovering some of those histories and doing that historical work. And I think I want to share one story about our experience on the Mobile Homecoming Project, because I think that it's so true. There's been so much energy, there have been shifts, and there have been milestones, but I think that I had an experience, Julia and I we had a 1988 Winnebago with Shayro, and we went everywhere, basically trying to talk to folks of all ages, but specifically elders who were Black LGBTQ feminist warriors. And we went to Jacksonville, Florida, and right now in Jacksonville, in terms of what we would commonly understand as civil rights and like non-discrimination clauses, people can be kicked off their job, kicked out of their house for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, any of it. I mean, they have principals shutting down all student activities in the entire county because some students wanted to start a GSA at their school. They shut down the football team, they shut down everything just to say, no, our young people will not have this conversation, right? And so when we were there, And we were doing what we do is to create space for intergenerational conversations where people can say, oh, this was my story, or this is where I was in 1966, or this is what I remember growing up, what my experiences were with segregation, also as a lesbian woman of that time. You know, all of those stories happen in those spaces, but I have to tell you that that was the one place, and I feel like it's directly connected to the civil rights struggles that have not been won in that place, where people looked at us and they were happy to share their stories with us. They were happy that we were there listening to them, and they showed up, and it was beautiful to meet them. And they were like, but you can't record this. Just memorize what I'm telling you, and carry it with you. Carry it with you in your body. Carry it with you wherever you go. But it is not. I mean, and that was a huge act of generosity for them to even show up and be with us in that way. But it's not safe. So I think that the question is more than a question of like an oral history project or, you know, a research, you know, a set of research conditions to say how can people who were not able to be out in the movement that they made happen, how can we have those stories now? How can we have that movement now where people can be safe as who they are? You know, like how can we really hold folks in that way? And I think that one of the major things that we found as we traveled around the country doing this mobile homecoming project is the issues are still housing and healthcare and poverty. The issues are still the issues that are causing people to not be able to be fully expressed as who they are, whether that means expressing their genius in whatever ways they would express it or expressing their love and creating their family. I think that that's something we really do have to grapple with. So I don't want to, you know, I definitely don't want to be negative about the incredible resilience of all of our communities and what has happened, but I do want to say that it's not just a question of gathering. It's not just a question of, you know, okay, now, you know, now it's 2014. Everybody stand up and raise your hand if you were queer and you were in the civil rights movement and you never told anybody then. It's like, it's more than a notion, you know, and I think that was a surprising experience to me, but it was real. Sylvia Wynter, the Jamaican theorist, says the ceremony must be found. After humanism, the ceremony must be found, and I think that we are still, maybe we're participating in a part of it now, but we are still finding the ceremony for how people are able to truly express who they are, stand up for each other. You know, so I think that, I really love that you raised that question earlier, and I love that there's support behind it, because I think that we do need to do the work to be able to find our warriors.
Yes.
When and where can they be safe to say who they are, to say what they did, to let us know the lessons that we need to know beyond the trauma that they've experienced for doing the work that we benefit from.
Thank you very much, Alexis. I'll just put on my English professor cap and say that it was painful for me to hear that when you were doing these interviews that they wouldn't allow them to be recorded. We are in desperate need of maintaining our archives and increasing them. All of us are people who are working in arts and culture, and many of us are university professors. We are in desperate need of increasing our archives in everything having to do with Black people, the African diaspora, the LGBT movement, just everything. We need to do a better job of it. I have to say, unfortunately, that my handlers have gotten to me, and that we're going to move from this stage of the conversation to taking questions from the audience.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.